into the Q&A box. So with that, I will hand it over to Chad Edison, Chief Deputy Secretary for Rail and Transit.
Thank you very much, Josh, and I appreciate everybody joining this morning, this early morning. There are a number that are still coming in, and welcome to the webinar. We will also have a second webinar tomorrow focused primarily on small and rural agencies. Both presentations will be similar, but we expect the questions to be somewhat different between the two groups. But any of your colleagues that couldn't make it today that want to attend tomorrow are welcome tomorrow, even if you're from a large agency. So thank you everybody for joining. Let's go to the next slide, please. Today I'm going to be giving a quick background and some of the key details related to the Cycle 5 2022 guidelines. I'll go through the discussion of funding, the comparison, the major things that changed between the discussion draft and this version, some key considerations to remind potential applicants of, and share some CARB links and resources that are relevant to preparing your projects for application. I also go back over the timeline for the awards and take some questions at the end. On to the next slide, please. Since 2015, TIRCP has programmed $5.8 billion in funding to 74 projects throughout the state. And our program focuses on priority populations. Nearly every project submitted has a direct, meaningful, and assured benefit to disadvantaged communities, low-income communities, or low-income households. And we expect the vast majority of the applications that come in to have these kinds of benefits. We also focus on ensuring geographic equity, and I'll talk more to that later in the presentation. Next slide. This is a very partial list. I can't put 74 examples up here, but the selected projects from the past are all listed on our website. It's in the program page on CalSTA for the Transit Intercity Rail Capital Program. And just some highlights of projects that we've funded. In the transit and rail infrastructure category, we funded a couple of projects with CCJPA, extending service to Roseville, some improvements at the Sacramento Valley Station, also a travel time improvement project early on. BART Silicon Valley Phase 2 is receiving funding through this program. A number of LA Metro projects. In the zero emission front, there's many projects I could have put here, but Torrance Transit Department last round got a bus service enhancement program funded. San Bernardino County has both a BRT and Redlands Passenger Rail project funded. And in terms of service expansion, we have a significant capacity increase supported through a BART project on the Transbay Core Capacity Program and with SAC-RT. You can go to our website and see the other projects that have been selected, and that might help understand the types of projects that have received money through this program. Next slide, please. In terms of the statutory requirements, this is a competitive 5-year program to fund a small number of transformative projects that improve the statewide network and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And both of those need to be achieved. We have to both increase ridership and reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the projects that we select. The primary evaluation criteria are the emissions reductions, the ridership growth, achievement of integrated service, and safety benefits. And then on secondary evaluation criteria, we have the co-benefits of broader sustainable community goals, disadvantaged community benefits, geographic balance, network integration, housing and jobs considerations, and other factors. And you can see that in the guidelines, which again are posted on our website. There's more detail there. Next slide, please. The funding for our program primarily comes from transportation improvement fee revenues and a continuous 10% appropriation of greenhouse gas reduction funds. The current new capacity for our program through 26-27, through fiscal year 26-27, is around $500 to $600 million. That number may be updated prior to the call for projects and could also change during the application period. As we expect to make awards next June, the auction proceeds results will in part inform our program, as will any major cash flow changes in existing projects that might open up additional capacity before fiscal year 27. The largest amount of funding from our program, most of that $500 to $600 million, is available in fiscal years 25-26 and 26-27. So that means if you're not getting to construction for for 3 years. That's actually well lined up with when the money is available in our program. But we do have the capacity to fund less expensive phases and smaller projects in 22-23 through fiscal year 24-25. And again, we constantly monitor the cash flow of our projects, and should we have additional resources prior to fiscal year 27, we would add those to the program for the current round. And we also have a potential for state assistance in securing financing of the local match for rural agencies. I can speak more to that tomorrow, but if there are questions on that today, I'd be glad to speak to that as well. Go on to the next slide, please. In the discussion draft, we introduced a number of new emphases in our Cycle 5 guidelines. We added references to CAPDI and related executive orders. We described our process for providing additional pre-application and post-award technical assistance. We have a more developed description of pathways to zero-emission fleet and facilities investments that also increase ridership. And then we reference the role played by contactless payment and real-time traveler information in increasing ridership. We updated our primary and secondary evaluation criteria to reflect new references to HCD's pro-housing policies. These are not, this is another way of qualifying projects on secondary benefits, but there are other options as well. And then finally, we updated references to the CTC project allocation policy. Go on to the next slide. In terms of further clarifications that we made in the discussion draft, and the references here are to a document that was on our website and is still on our website, and it's titled the Formal and Discussion Draft Comparison Document. Some highlights there. We included microtransit in the definition of transit. We showed that both software and hardware related to microtransit integrated ticketing and scheduling systems are eligible for funding. ZEV leases are eligible for funding, but you need to then show the benefits modeled over a period that matches the duration of the lease. Multiple applications are allowed, but we clarified that programmatic applications that include interrelated projects are often more helpful in qualifying for at least partial funding of your program of projects. We identified that geographic equity it was clarified in terms of its impact on project funding expectations, and I'll speak to that again on a later slide. Resubmission of the same project for more money is addressed with a number of comments there, and then HCD updated its pro-housing policy list to reflect its updated policies. Go on to the next slide, please. In terms of some considerations for applicants, when we speak to priority populations, as I said earlier, projects are expected to contribute direct, meaningful, and assured benefits, and those benefits need to be confirmed through a number of different mechanisms that are explained in our guidelines and will be further detailed in our call for projects. One point I would like to make here is that extending access beyond fixed routes using zero-emission microtransit is a valuable strategy to expanding benefits, especially when combined with other program elements that provide priority population benefits. Our program focus on geographic equity, I'd like to address that in a little bit more detail. The geographic equity is considered within each funding cycle, but we also look at underrepresentation in past funding cycles. And so if projects come in areas of the state that have not had significant numbers of projects or funding in the past, we would look at that through the multi-cycle lens. And then finally, requirements for geographic equity on our program limit the amount of funding that any given project sponsor or project could expect. We wouldn't expect, for example, a project in Sacramento to come in with 50% of the total program resources requested, given its area of the state and the population involved. So that just is an example of geographic equity and how it interplays with the amount of funding that any given project can expect. We don't have a maximum project amount for application, but again, that depending on where you are in the state, the amount that you might expect in an award would be influenced by geographic equity. On to the next slide. Another focus here is that clean fleet, facility, and network improvement projects that address those three factors can receive funding. So replacing aging vehicles with zero emission vehicles, making fueling and charging infrastructure in facility modifications. These are eligible projects. They generally need to be paired with investments that improve your network efficiency in terms of making transit a priority on roads. That can allow savings in vehicle hours, and you can redeploy those hours into increased service on the same or other routes. Implementing improvements to your payment systems that are likely to increase ridership are also key example investments. And finally, improving integration efforts with other corridors through service restructuring. Doing that within your own agency or with other operators, these are also keys to increasing network ridership, which can be counted as a benefit to your project. So that's just a focus on clean technology here. We have not in recent years funded anything that wasn't a zero emission vehicle. So that's something that should also be noted, is that zero emission vehicles are expected as the primary vehicle type. Those vehicles perform much better in the benefits calculations. And again, agencies that come into our program have generally submitted projects that are zero emission in nature. Go on to the next slide, please. In terms of housing and job considerations, recognizing that transit supportive land use is a key influencing factor of ridership, many projects have used that as a basis of supporting their ridership increase modeling. So that's something that, clearly where your land uses are a factor leading you to higher ridership and higher growth in ridership. Many of our projects, especially those that involved fixed infrastructure, have us up to 50 years of benefits. And so to the extent that your zoning and your projects that are expected in the corridor are such that your population along the corridors is expected to grow, that should show up in your ridership forecasts for the future, both when you open your service and then, of course, as your service grows in ridership over time as the population in the region grows. For projects that link housing with key destinations and improve accessibility to economic opportunities, this is also an area where the housing policies and job location policies can influence your project benefits. We have a way to look at housing's impact, both in terms of these primary criteria where it mainly shows up in the ridership forecast, but also in the secondary benefits. And to the extent that you have expected benefits that are difficult to model, we expect you to address those in the secondary criteria portion of your application. Go on to the next slide, please. In terms of our overall approach to project implementation, if a project does not receive its funding commitments, there are some projects that can get selected with contingent funding commitments, such as federal funding that you're expecting to be successful in turning into a full funding grant agreement, or local measure money that is anticipated for the project. If those funding commitments are not met, CalSTA can delete the project from our program, and you could, of course, come back in a future round with that project when funding is more certain. We also have, if your project changes in its scope after award in a significant way that influences its benefits, that also could lead to deletion of the project from the program and a need to reapply. Agencies are now expected to also report on job co-benefits in addition to the other reporting requirements. And there's a co-benefit modeling tool based on a methodology developed by CARB that's part of the application process. For most projects, your annual reporting on outcomes will continue for 3 years after the project becomes operational. That fluctuates a little bit because some projects have elements that become operational before others do. And so that's kind of a project-specific reporting that could go longer than 3 years if you have multiple projects that overlap as in your program that is funded. Next slide, please. As I'm getting close to the end of the formal part of the presentation, we have We have a number of links here that can be helpful in terms of quantification methodologies, a CARB webinar, which provides an overview of the QM and calculator tool. We will probably schedule an additional webinar before, during the process of applicants preparing for their submission of applications this next cycle, and then a sustainable transportation benefit criteria table that gives you an idea of what we're reporting for the annual report and the mid-year data updates once your project is selected. On to the next slide, please. Our timeline here, we're doing our 2 workshops today and tomorrow. We then have a guidelines adoption and call for project expected on November 19th. We have 2 rounds of consultation, technical assistance that we are encouraging applicants to make use of. This will give you both a sense of whether your project is well aligned with the program, how to address any challenges that you have with understanding what the guidelines and call for projects require, and will also help you better align your program of projects within your agency with what might be successful in our program. So those rounds, we're doing 2 rounds this time for the first time, one in December, one in January. And you are encouraged and welcome to schedule in both of those times, given that those are different points in your consideration of the applications and development of the applications to be submitted to our program. Applications for this cycle are due on March 3rd, 2022, and we expect an award announcement in June. Next slide, please. So we'll get to questions here. Just a couple of final comments for me to make. The TIRCP website, there's a link to it here. Guidelines, comments, go to the dot.ca.gov email that is here, trcpcomments@dot.ca.gov. Comments are due in by November 10th of 2021 so that they can be responded to and reflected in our final program guidelines. And then also, if you'd like to ask general questions at any time about TIRCP or join our mailing list, please also email trcpcomments@dot.ca.gov. We'll go ahead and keep this slide up as we prepare to respond to questions that have been coming in. And with that, Josh, do you want to provide any further comments before we start going through the questions?
Yes, thanks, Jed. So yeah, we'll now go and move into our Q&A section. Again, please type any comments you have into the question and answer box. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Again, we'll try to do our best to get through what we can in the time that we do have remaining this morning. And other questions that we don't get to, again, we will respond to those over the coming days as we continue into this cycle. So with that, we'll open it up to Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So thank you, Josh. I'm going through the Q&A from top to bottom, starting with a question from Hillary Blackerby, submitted at 8:42. Is there a difference in the information presented today versus tomorrow? And how does CalSTA define large versus small and rural? There's not a significant difference in the information between today and tomorrow. It's the same slide deck with a different list of projects focusing more on the small projects that have been awarded money in the past. So the only slide that's likely to change is the one that lists the example projects. The definition of large versus small and rural is not important to our program itself. It is more the way that we have noticed different types of questions that are relevant. In this round, one of the things that we're going to be talking about for the small and rural agencies is the way in which the program can help them address their fleet replacement and facility investments in the context of growing ridership. And so that will be special emphasis there. It's also relevant to the large agencies, but large agencies tend to have more of the fixed infrastructure kinds of projects than the small and rural do. I hope that helps understand it, but it's not a distinction that we specifically make in our project selection process. The grant support initiatives that provide fair subsidies in disadvantaged populations. This is coming from Catherine. The grant process here does not provide operating funding. And so we don't have money in our program that can provide for fair subsidies. Often we see agencies use LC-TOP, the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, or other funding sources for that. Now we do have ways of helping with specific projects that might be helpful in lowering some of your operating costs, and so that's probably the place in which we have the most benefits here. To the extent that the project that you're submitting to us does help lower those operating costs, one of the effective strategies that many applicants have used in the past has been to show how that operating budget savings would get redeployed into things like fair subsidies to disadvantaged populations. And so showing what you do with the operating savings can be part of your application, and it's one that enhances the benefits in your application. I have another comment about the pro-housing elements. And the question is, are the pro-housing elements that have been added to the guidelines limited to how ridership should be estimated? Or will these be part of prioritizing criteria? Most transit agencies have limited to no control over local housing development. There are two different places that we talk about the impact of housing and land use on your projects. The pro-housing element is in our secondary criteria, not in the primary. But to the extent that policies in your area have led to modelable results on your increase in ridership, that is something to note in the primary evaluation criteria section. With regards to so we do. I'm just going back to my guidelines here. We do talk about how the existing designation of pro-housing can be a basis for which you would model more benefits. But in terms of the checklist of policies, this is really in a category that is tied to your secondary benefits. So one of our secondary benefit categories is coordinating with local governments to facilitate the location of employment and or housing in the transit stop or station area. And the evidence for this can be either through the pro-housing designation program or through transit-oriented development that your project is coordinated with. So that's the main way that this shows up. It's not that we're expecting agencies to have direct control of local housing, but your projects where they are coordinated with the plans of the region, and you're putting transit where that housing is allowed and where transit-oriented development is expected, that is a secondary evaluation criteria. I hope that helps with the question. If there's more on that topic, we'd be glad to either take it in the future or and try to respond to it with a direct requester or in an FAQ on our website. Yes, the recording is available on our website after the webinar, and so we are going to have this posted as soon as we can get it processed and available. And I believe you can request a link to the recording from the Caltrans team that is supporting this program. In terms of projects that fund zero-emission vehicle expansion, can an agency compete if most of what is requested is for technology transition, not related to service expansion? I think this is one. Let's see, I'm trying to understand the full question here. Projects that are funding zero-emission vehicle expansion, should be tied specifically to their benefits in increasing ridership and reducing emissions. So I think the way in which you achieve that can depend on a number of linked investments, and depending on what project you have in mind, that can be different for each agency. I would encourage agencies that have questions about how various things can be linked in an integrated program to come to the technical assistance sessions that we have especially the ones in December, so that you can get feedback on how projects generally would be programmed together to create the benefits that are expected in the program. In terms of signing up for meetings, one of the questions that came in is, will the ability to schedule an applicant meeting start with a call for projects date? It doesn't start then if you already know you want to come in with a applicant meeting. You can request that anytime, and we will try to keep track of that through our comments box. We will start scheduling them, and many of them will probably be virtual this round. In past rounds, we've traveled to a number of regions of the state. I think we can get more meetings done if we are virtual on this round. So we're going to schedule those after. We'll have more instructions in the call for projects, but if you already know you want one of those meetings, it doesn't hurt for us to know that soon. Okay, getting back to the question list. I'm coming back to the housing side of this. The pro-housing designation is one way to get credit for having transit supportive housing in your region. It's not the only way, and so just to be clear, to the extent that that there are projects that are supporting the growth in your ridership and that they are present, you can speak to them even if you don't have that designation. Are TRCP funds eligible for planning activities? They are, but not planning only. So we do not. We have to have a specific outcome of ridership growth and reduced greenhouse gas emissions on every project. And so we don't fund only the planning and project development phase of a project. Our money can be used for that phase, but not exclusively. In some cases, the planning process and the of redesigning your network, for example, is part of how you get to a more efficient operation and a higher ridership operation. And if those activities are supportive of your program of projects, we encourage you to include those in your application, so that you can achieve the maximum benefits possible through your capital investments. And going back to the list here, we will have I see one that we missed earlier. We will have a priority populations advisory committee. The nature of that is being developed right now in terms of determining the best way to review the priority populations benefits, but we definitely will have an advisory panel that looks at the issues related to delivering meaningful benefits to priority populations. In terms of a question on, the questions are coming in, I keep losing my place in this on the scroll. In terms of, there's a question on, will there be a preference to fund zero emission buses and infrastructure to smaller and rural agencies? There is no specific preference to small and rural agencies. We do have some financing techniques that could be possible for those agencies tied to infrastructure financing. And we also consider geographic equity to the extent that small and rural agencies are in parts of the state that have not previously received significant funding. They would be looked at through that lens of geographic equity. Okay, and I have a question from Stephanie who asking for elaboration on geographic equity. I think I've already provided that elaboration in my comments here. We do look at underrepresentation of geographies from over the past cycles and are looking to have the program benefit the entire state. So don't just because there hasn't been a project funded in your region of the state, don't assume that means that you can't be funded in the future. Can investments in pedestrian safety, just a second, every time somebody submits a question, it goes back to the top. Can investments in pedestrian safety and or comfort and new or improved active transportation facilities on or connecting to bus stops be considered as an example of network integration be competitive? That really depends on the specific project and how those elements, they certainly can be funded through a program. How they, if you have matching funds, that often helps improve your overall benefits. So we encourage projects to include active transportation elements and pedestrian safety elements. One of our primary criteria is improving safety. So that is key. The overall project, however, still needs to be competitive in terms of its cost per ton of GHG emissions reduced. It needs to have a significant contribution to increased ridership. And so I wouldn't say there's an unlimited amount of that can be added to a project if that project is otherwise not having a major impact on ridership and reducing GHG emissions. But it certainly is a part of how you can achieve those goals. There's a question here of whether there's a set aside for preparation for the Olympics. No, there is not in this program. The legislature has considered that during the budget process, and should there be additional funding at some point added by the legislature in future legislative actions, which I know we are certainly interested in seeing what proposals come in that area. That would likely affect a future round of funding, not this one. So I hope that answers that question. I welcome additional questions to be submitted. We have the last one received as of about a minute ago, and I'm glad to take more questions if they are forthcoming.
And Chad, there's also 3 other questions too. I'm not sure if you saw these. The first one is, will funding be available for project management support to deploy projects?
Okay, so and where are these questions appearing? I'm not seeing them are they in the Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, hold on, let me see if I can find that. What time was that submitted? I'm gonna read it.
8:45.
Okay. Try to answer it. Okay, I'm not seeing it here, but so was there? The question is there funding for project management and support?
Yes. Will funding be available for project management support to deploy projects?
Yes, in fact, if agencies have a cost involved in managing the project's implementation, that is something that we encourage agencies to document in their request as one of the things that they would like to spend budget resources on. And in fact, if to the extent that agencies have multiple funding sources on their program, even if you have some of this covered by your local funds, by your agency funds, but it's part of managing the project, we encourage you to show the full cost of your project, not just the specific capital element that you're funding, but also the money to manage that if you're seeking reimbursement for staff work on the project. You should follow standard practices with regards to your agency's approach to charging to capital projects. and indirect costs that are related to that should be documented as well through a standard plan that is auditable. But we certainly have had agencies need to, hire significant, additional staff in many cases to handle projects that they don't only have to be done through consulting resources, but project management is certainly something that is part of the typical capital budget of a project. Other questions, Josh? I don't see any more in the Q&A box, unless, hold on, there might be one more here. Must projects be, I see another one from James Andrew, must projects be defined at the time of application for street upgrades related to transit? Or can we leave specific details open to allow us to incorporate community engagement? Actually, the latter is preferable to the extent it hasn't already been done. However, so you do not need every project detail related to how you're going to do those upgrades. Many projects haven't finished their full engineering at the time of award. However, one thing I should note, there are different things that need to be defined before you can get the allocation at the CTC for the phase of project, your project that you are funding. There often are multiple allocations for various phases that you're receiving TIRCP funding at the CTC. What I would be clear on here is that, if you're still going to go through a process to work on the specific details, that's actually something we can fund. I would note that to the extent that your project is further back from construction, you are taking more risk when you submit a project to us for funding. We cannot give more money to the same project later on if your cost goes up relative to what you submitted your budget based on when you first came into the program. So we do lock in our match at that time, and agencies that are a number of years from construction have often had to find additional funding resources in order to move their project forward if they did not allow enough contingency in their original budgets submitted to our program. So that would just be the one caution there, is that if there's significant risk related to your budget in that area, you should make allowance for some of that. Let's see if I can. Are there other questions that I'm missing here? Caltrans team, if you see others, please raise them.
I think that's all that I see currently.
Yeah, we have another question. Will project goals and objectives need to provide benefits to priority populations as defined by the newer version of Cal EnviroScreen 4.0 instead of 3.0?
I will have to get back to you on that question unless I have somebody here from CARB that can address the timing of that. We generally use the most current version that's been adopted of Cal EnviroScreen. We will be addressing this, at the time of our call for projects, but we certainly don't use an old version if a new version is available at the time of project application.
Hey, Chad, this is Eric Helseth from CARB. And we are in the process of, kind of integrating CES 4.0 into our QMs currently. But I don't have an exact timeline on when that will be implemented. So I'll have to get back to you and update you there. But for now, using the 3.0
okay,
for our QMs, yeah.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate that. Yeah, this is we generally go with whatever's been fully integrated at the time of call for projects. So we will, if there's a change in that, we will update our guidelines appropriately. But right now, it would be Cal EnviroScreen 3.0. Okay, well, I'll give it just another minute for any further questions. Appreciate everybody participating. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and should you have further questions or comments, please submit them to tircpcomments@dot.ca.gov. Doing that prior to November 10th is appreciated, but no later than November 10th if you want your comments to be considered in the context of coming out with our final guidelines. Appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.